Hello, it's lovely to be here in front of you today in the dark. I am somebody who listens to a lot of stories, and I'm somebody who tells stories. Before you get excited though, I want to tell you this is not actually going to be a big epic tale today. That's not what I'm here for. I am going to tell you when I realized that stories could save my life. But I'm going to do that right after I tell you what we're talking about today. That's called a cliffhanger. So how stories saved my life. I'm going to talk about stories and how they work. First, I'm going to talk a bit about how I came to that, and then I'm going to talk to you about what I've learned about stories. I've decided I'm actually not going to talk as much about brand today, mostly because of the time we have, and I really want to answer your questions. But if you've come here today with a question about brand, I'm going to invite you to email it to me or to ask in the AMA, because I don't want you to go home without your brand questions answered, but we'll do another session on brand. So the AMA is what we're aiming at. An AMA means an Ask Me Anything. You probably already know that. You're all Reddit fans. And I want to actually suggest that everybody think of a question that you want to ask. And the reason is, it often makes you listen differently, but it often means, too, you don't get to the end of the session and feel blank and think of it later. So I want to invite everybody, if you would, to think of a question. I used to be a teacher. If I don't see any questions on the screen at the back, I may just call you out and embarrass you. Just threatening, just being nice, just trying to help. So I want to invite you to think of a question. My dad grew up in Sheffield, in the north of England, and he left school at 16 to go and work in the steel mill. And my mom, on the right, her name is Mary, she grew up in a little village called Whitley Bay in Northumberland, and when she left school, she became a secretary, and she actually won a typing competition. That's not actually relevant to the story, I just thought I'd tell you. They are actually both here today, which is really sweet. I'm not going to make them come up and talk about typing or about the steel mill. Now, everything was going well for them. They were teachers. They had gone to All Sager, which is a teacher training college in England, and my dad had become a shop teacher. My mom was a home ec teacher. But for some reason, they decided to move to Calgary in the late 70s or 80s with me. Now, this is what I remember about the time. Our neighbor across the street, whose name was Ron, used to get up and put a suit on with a Stetson, with cowboy boots, and he would get into his Ford Bronco, and he would drive to work in an oil company downtown. And that was pretty much like every man on the block. His wife, Marlene, managed the home front, and she drove a wood-paneled station wagon, something I still have a fondness for today, let's say. But that was pretty much the scene. On the other hand, my dad at this time was doing a PhD in art education. Obviously, that's a longer story. My mom was teaching elementary school, and I was going to French school out of area. I was an alien. Like, I don't want you to think I didn't have any friends. I had some friends. Things were normal-ish. But you know that Sesame Street thing, one of these things is not like the other? I was aware that was me. I felt like a total outsider. My mom even sewed a lot of my clothes, something that now I think is super rad, but I think you're getting a picture of what that was like. So one day, when my parents started watching Dallas, I was like, Dallas can explain the world to me. I started watching Dallas with the fervor of a religious convert. It was like the language, the jokes, the clothing. Look at the clothing. I mean, honestly, it was the talk about oil, the talk about business, and I was like, Dallas might just be the key to everything. Years later, I became a teacher, and something I noticed is that some students just knew how to tell a story. Other students listened to them when they talked in class discussion. They laughed at their jokes. When those same students said to me, Miss Richmond, the dog ate my homework, I would find myself listening to them and laughing, probably even forgiving them. Other students, I would be like, okay, why did Macbeth kill the king? And they would be like, they would start at the beginning of Macbeth. Do you guys know what I'm talking about here? And they would just factually tell me every single thing that had happened in the story so far. And I was like, okay, thank you for that, yeah. So I actually got really interested in stories because what I started to believe even then is that storytelling is learned. It's not innate. It's not just that those kids who are good at it were born like that and the rest of us just have to kind of admire them. There are some things that are learned. And I started coaching the debate team. You didn't know it could get any nerdier, did you? Well, it just did. It just did. Sometimes I'd go to a debate and it would be like the Stanley Cup. There were like thousands of people in the stands and it was like amazing. Not ever. Sometimes I was the only one in the stands, just me and the kids. On a Saturday in a school classroom. The national championships were actually, this is a side story, in this town called Edam, Saskatchewan. I went there one year. The whole town farmed early in the morning so that they could come to watch the debates, and it's the only time I have been in a full audience. It was farmers in a town. It was incredible. Anyway, moving on. So I used to coach the debate team, and what we would do in practice is we would run drills back and forth, up and down, on how to tell the story in a really convincing way, because ultimately, there's a system. One of the students I taught, one of the students I co-coached, her name was Sarah Mortazavi. She won, get ready for this, the World Junior Public Speaking and Debate Championship. Yes, she did. She's actually now an assistant district attorney in New York. But after she won that, I went on and did a documentary about her for the CBC called The Terminator, because that's what she was called. And Sarah would listen to Metallica on her way into each round, which she won. She was amazing. Years later, I actually became a journalist, and I wrote about pop culture, mostly about the values debates that were happening in pop culture and what those could teach us about the world. And I realized I was still doing the same thing as when I was 4 or 6 or 7 and watching Dallas. I was looking for a way to understand the world. But something I found, other than having tragic bangs, was that I every week would think of a topic I wanted to write about, and I would call up an academic. And I would have them unpack it for me, because academics have spent at least 10,000 hours studying that thing. And I would call them and I would say, can you explain this to me? And I would get the benefit of all their knowledge, which was magic, by the way. But something I noticed is that some of them were really good at telling me the story about what they knew. And the piece I had to write would almost write itself. And almost invariably, those were the posts, the stories, that got the most traffic. It started with that person knowing how to talk about what they know. Other times, I would work really hard to bring their story to light, but it never quite got there in the same way. Just keep shaking. You think that's the solution? Or bang it on something. Oh, here we go. So while I was working as a journalist, I also started writing company stories. Let's be honest, interviewing academics didn't necessarily pay that well. So the first CEO I interviewed, I actually went downtown. It was a building on Burrard Street, and the CEO welcomed me in the lobby, and he walked me down this hallway with all these posters of their projects. And with each one, he would tell me how the successes of one project led to the successes of the next. And I realized as he was talking, I was really impressed. I was like, wow, this guy has his shit together way better than I do. But I was also actually not that interested. I was forcing myself to listen to his stories, and it's because there wasn't really anything in them that could help me understand the world. On the other hand, I was speaking to the founder of a company not very long ago, and he told me this story about how when he was growing up in Comox on Vancouver Island, his experience of kelp was that it was this great thing because it meant he could whip his brother with it. And he thought of kelp as this like brown, squishy, gross thing on the beach, which, having talked to other people, I get this common sense. But then a few years ago, from his house in Hornby, he looked out and he realized that all the kelp was gone. It had been there for decades, just outside his living room. And it was the very beginning of COVID, and everything felt kind of topsy-turvy. I'm sure you remember that feeling. And he was grief-stricken, and it felt like one more piece about the world that didn't make sense at that moment. So he decided he wanted to find out what was going on. So he founded a group of scientists, and they went out to try to figure out what it was. And what they discovered was that there had been this very hot heat wave a few years ago. It was called the blob. I'm not sure if you remember hearing about that. And what happened was that a lot of sea stars died. Well, it turns out sea stars eat sea urchins, and sea urchins eat kelp. So without the sea stars, the urchin populations were running rampant. They were just having a party down there, eating all the kelp. And the hot temperatures were killing the kelp from above, so kelp was literally getting it in both directions. And so they decided they wanted to figure out what they could do. They found out then that BC has more species of kelp than anywhere else in the world. So if they could figure it out here, they would actually potentially solve the decline of kelp across the whole world. And then they also discovered from a scientist who was working on it that kelp can actually help reverse climate change by sequestering carbon. So they have set out to find a species of kelp that can survive these water temperatures. They want to scale it and bring kelp back to the BC coast, and then they want to share that with the world. So when I met these scientists, when I heard this story, I was like, this is the kind of story that helps me. Because I'm upset about climate change. I'm upset about COVID. Things feel weird to me. And hearing what other people think and feel and what they decide to do about it literally feeds me. Just like Dallas, just like Sue Ellen and Bobby, who didn't die, by the way, end of that episode, just in case you missed that. Okay, so now I'm going to bring this back to you. That's how I got into this. And what I do now mostly is I help other people tell their stories, and now you know why. And what I found through all that experience is that there are a few things that make a good story. I did some research about 6 months ago. I interviewed a few dozen people who were CEOs and founders, people in private equity firms and VCs, and I asked them what their most important jobs are. What it is that they actually do. And I want to tell you in particular what 2 CEOs from E at UBC said to me. One said, as a startup, but as an entrepreneur of any kind, what we're doing is we're trying to get people to join us in some way, to join with us, to help us. One CEO in the program told me that most of her time is spent trying to inspire potential investors, potential partners, granting bodies, other scientists, the public, the media, and her team. She said, my job is all about inspiring. She looked kind of tired, by the way, but yeah, I think it's because it's early stage. A lot of inspiring. So show of hands, how many people feel that way about the work that they do? You're trying to get people in. Yeah, okay. Another CEO who came through this program, who actually ended up selling the company for $118 million, told me that you have to kiss a lot of frogs to find a prince. And that was his job. He was the chief frog kisser. What we do when we kiss frogs, what he did when he kissed frogs, is he told them the company's story again and again in just slightly different ways, all day, at conferences, at coffees, at meetings, at events, on the phone, in person, to his banker, to new staff, to everybody. Because you fundamentally never know what will happen. You don't know if this is a conversation with an investor who's gonna give you 10 million. Most of the time it will go nowhere. Sometimes you tell someone who tells a cousin, who tells a brother, who tells a friend, and they end up working with you. You just don't know. So it's just what you have to keep doing. So you have to recognize your job is the chief storyteller. And something I heard from him is that he believes there's a kind of formula. And research would support that. There are actually quite a few formulas. There's something called the ring cycle, which is some work some academics did which found that every fairy tale fundamentally has the same structure, and a lot of religions actually tell stories in that same structure. Umberto Eco, if you're interested in this, realized that every James Bond novel has exactly the same structure. Law and Order, I don't know if anyone's ever watched that. They have the same structure down to the minute. It was the longest running show on television, by the way, just saying. But the story structure I want to tell you about today is from Pixar. Now, Pixar is a studio in LA. I'm sure you know about it. It was founded by George Lucas, and turned around by Steve Jobs. And there was this story editor whose name was Emma Coates, and she was taking over basically as head of story. And she was feeling like she really wanted to get a sense of what it was that made Pixar stories special. What is a Pixar story? So she analyzed all of them, and she found this formula. So I want to kind of run you through it because it's pretty interesting. The first is Once Upon a Time. Now, this is not the origin story like in 2017 we got together because we wanted to. It's not that. It's the thing that got you in. It's the thing that inspired you. It's the thing that bothered you. It's a personal experience you had. It's something that's actually quite profound, bothersome, interesting, something that's calling to you. That's where the story starts. The next piece is this thing that Pixar calls every day. It's like, what was the character's life before the discovery they had? But another way to think of this is like, it's all the charts. It's the extent of the problem. The Al Gore chart comes out at some point or another. It's like, here is what is going wrong right now. Here is the extent of the problem. Then there's the one day. One day is like, what happens in a story? What happens to throw the character's life off track? But like in The Hobbit, when Gandalf knocks on the door, right? That's this moment. But if it's the story of your company, it's something that turns up the heat on the origin story. Something gets worse. Something happens that changes what you're seeing go out in the world, and you're like, okay, I've got to figure this out. Then there's the because of this, and it's after this incident, there's some kind of quest you go on, some decision you make to get to the bottom of it, and then there's another because of that, which is generally a twist. Something gets harder, or I don't know, there's just something unexpected that you had to deal with in this story. Like in Romeo and Juliet, you know, there's the obstacle. It's another obstacle, basically, because it turns up the heat so that in the end, you are triumphant. You have this discovery, you have this realization. There have been long nights in the lab, and eureka, here is the answer. And then there's gonna be this hope, this optimism, this brave new world when this solution you have found is implemented. And we want that for you. We listen because we want that for you. Someone told me that every story is fundamentally a mystery story. And to go back to Law and Order, which 29 years, they start every episode with some form of chaos, something uncomfortable, and we know that by the end it's going to be resolved. It's why we watch. We want to see, how does this end, and then I'm going to feel better, and I can get on with my life. And that's what we want in a story. We want difficulty, chaos, etc., so that it all comes together. I'm not suggesting you slavishly use this formula, but I am suggesting you start with it. The CEOs I've worked with who have been ultimately very successful take something like this And then they change it hundreds or thousands of times. They practice in the mirror, they tell friends and family, they tell anybody who is willing to listen to their story, because what they're doing is they're watching for your reactions. Do you get it? Do you think that's funny? Did you laugh? Oh, you didn't laugh. Okay. Do you look interested? Are you looking bored? Do you have that look of getting it, or do you have the look of being confused? They're studying you so that they can go home and they can even just change a word or two to get their story closer to the one that's going to get people in. That's number 2. Number 3 is something I call the simplicity paradox, which frankly I have to simplify. It's a little bit complicated. But it comes from Neil deGrasse Tyson. Hands up who's heard of this guy. Oh, okay, good. We're among friends. So he wrote a book that came out earlier this year called Starry Messenger, Cosmic Perspectives on Civilization. So what he argues in this book is that scientists are essentially the best communicators in the world and the worst. And I think we can learn from both. Here's the way it goes when it's the best. 2 scientists get together. One argues something and has a piece of data to back it up. The other disagrees and has a piece of data to back that up. The first one either concedes or brings another piece of data, or the 2 of them agree they don't know and they go and have a beer, basically. That's when it goes well. Here's the other side, and I say this as a fan of science. Scientists are people who have spent tens of thousands of hours learning something that only 7 people in the world understand, and they love it. And when they go to tell you about it, they tell you the things that they learned in maybe the 30,000th hour that they spent on it. It's really exciting to them. And try as I might, I do not understand it. This is a great lesson for the rest of us because we all have that thing. Even if you're an entrepreneur who is not a scientist, there are things you know about the problem you're solving, something about your company that nobody else would understand. And I think our tendency as humans is to try to communicate, to try to validate what we're working on. So we bring that really esoteric thing to people. Believe me, there's a lot I could tell you about brand studies that would bore you even more than maybe you're bored now. Who knows? I'll try not to. So the lesson that we have here is that if the job is to tell stories, getting in to that esoteric stuff isn't going to help us. I think the word about that got out because often I meet with an entrepreneur, an expert, a scientist, and the first thing they tell me is, I've been told I gotta dumb it down. Or my other favorite, I've been told I gotta make it fluffy. They always use air quotes when they say make it fluffy. I don't know why. And I want to tell you, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because when you do that, you lose the essential part of your story. It does become dumb, and nobody likes to hear anything that's dumb. I was actually talking to a manager at a private equity firm a few months ago, and he told me the companies that become the 10-factor companies are the ones who have found a way to explain what they do simply. And I would like to suggest it's the hardest thing. But that kind of story structure I introduced is the way to start doing that, because it helps us think about how do I relate this thing I'm working on to somebody else so that they can get it. The next thing I want to tell you actually comes from when I was working as the managing editor of the Tyee, and I don't know if anyone knows about the Tyee, but there's an editor there called David Beers, and it was my job to buy stories for the Tyee. I would get all the pitches, and I would have to decide which ones do we run. And I would go to the story meeting, and I would say, okay, number one, because I was a super keener, you're really surprised, right? I would be like, number one, I think this is the story we should buy because I think our readers will really like it. And David Beers said to me, I am not paying you to tell me what you think our readers will like. I'm paying you to tell me which ones of the stories that you read got your pulse up. Because the stories that provoke a reaction in you are the ones that are most likely to provoke a reaction in someone else. That's how it works. And it also works when we are telling our own stories. So something I think we often forget is that we are telling stories not to users It's not a thing we have to get through. We are telling our stories to another human being. And when we run through a list of facts, generally we're not that interested, and neither are they. The challenge is when you've told that story 100 times, it can get a little stale. So the lesson here with the pulse test is somehow, as a storyteller, you have to keep connected to that thing that made you interested in it in the first place. And you have to become an actor, not a faker, but somebody who actually feels the story each time they tell it, connects with that. That is the job. There has never been a time when it's cheaper or easier to tell stories. AI can make most of our content, and some of it is pretty good. You can get free website templates, which on the one hand is this like great moment in the democratization of design. It used to be that only some people could afford websites and the rest looked like their little brother had made it in the basement. So suddenly we can all look kind of professional, and that's great. But those website templates are based on standardization of best practice. They make us look the same as everybody else. They do the things that work the best, whether that's a blue button or 3 modules at the top or even just the length of what to say, which is not a bad thing to pay attention to. I'm just saying we're surrounded by this kind of standardization. Same with Instagram. There's all these best practices about what works best. And we could easily just manufacture everything and kind of carry on. But what I would like to suggest is, as Sigmund Freud said, the only thing we can feel is difference. And AI cannot produce that for us yet. And at the heart of a good story is the part that makes it different, the part that makes it inspiring, the part that makes it yours and real and emotional. So there are 4 things then that I feel like I've learned. I've learned that every one of us needs to be a storyteller, but in particular, if you're an entrepreneur, because it's your job to get people in, and stories are how we do that. That there is a formula. I'm not talking about an AI kind of formula, but I'm saying there's somewhere you can start, that you can find a way to remember all the elements that make it a good story, and then go from there as you hone it and watch people's reactions to turn it into something that really is yours, that really does work. Thirdly, there's this simplicity paradox, which means it only works when it's simple, but it doesn't work when it's dumb. There's this way we have to retain the essence of the story without making it derivative. And when we can do that, that's when other people get it. And finally, we need to remember the pulse test. When we're listening to other people's stories, but mostly when we're telling our own, we have to pay attention to what interests me about this story and keep that alive, because chances are that is what will interest other people instead of a list of things we think we should get through. That's all I have for you today, luckily, because that may be my last slide. What I do want to do now is I want to ask you if you would engage in an AMA so that I can talk to you about what you're experiencing in your organization, what stories you're trying to tell, maybe where you're stuck, what you're thinking about, and I can hopefully offer you some insight or point you to somebody who can. So, are you writing your questions down?
They're on the screen behind you.
Oh, you're amazing. That is really magical. That's amazing. Okay, great. I haven't done this before. This is great. I want to do this with clients. So do I just start at the top?
Yeah, whatever.
Okay. So how many researchers have I worked with, and what single thing makes the biggest difference in the shortest amount of time for improving their ability to storytell? Okay. That's good. I've worked with dozens of researchers. It might be in the hundreds. And not just in science, but in a broad range of disciplines. And then, of course, there were all the researchers I interviewed when I was a journalist, and that was dozens and dozens. Of those 4 techniques, which is the one that makes the biggest difference, I'm going to say it's the idea of using a structure. because I think it gets us out of our own heads, out of our own eccentricities, and forces us to think a bit about what will make sense, what will bring this to life for somebody else. I think that's what I'd say. Did that answer your question? Whose question was that? Did that answer your question?
Yes.
So. Thank you. How to keep the balance in branding between mission and product as a startup. In other words, how far can you go with the mission so people still understand? I'm not sure I totally understand that question. Whose question is that? Oh, you don't want to add up. You don't want to admit it because I said your question was confusing. It could be me. Let's go with it's me who found that confusing. Okay, you don't have to confess who you are. Let me try to rephrase it and you tell me if I'm on something. Just wink. It's kind of dark though. I might miss it. Okay, let me see if I can actually get this to work. Okay, am I right in thinking what you're asking is this on? Oh, yeah. What you're asking is how much should you talk about the product itself when you're pitching to investors versus the mission? Is that right? Okay, let's say it is. I mean, you're going to have to get into your product at some point. But what I would say is the product conversation is usually the second conversation. The first conversation is usually the mission and the purpose and the vision. It's what got you inspired in the first place. And then you're going to want to give us just enough of the product so we know you actually have one. And we know that you have some sense of what you're doing. And it's really just enough to whet our appetites so that you can meet with them properly, probably with a scientist who's going to get into the nitty-gritty of it. Okay, I'm just going to hope that answered your question. What is your perspective of the most common pitfalls in regards to branding and how can you avoid it? I think I'm going to talk about the common pitfalls with story first, and then, because the branding's kind of a bigger topic, but I would say that the most common pitfall in storytelling is being factual. It's being too much fact too soon. I think going back to that idea that in a startup we're there because, or in any business, we're there because there's something we love. And I think we have a sense, especially with B2B, that our main job is to be credible. You want to come off as credible, especially if you're a new company. I know what I'm doing. I've done this before. You want to talk about the degrees you have or the years you've been doing it and the credibility of all your science. And that is important. But that can actually often be done really quickly just by using a few details. And instead, people spend all of their time that they have with somebody establishing facts and credibility, when in fact, it's kind of like going on a date. You know, what you need before somebody rolls out all the facts is you need to like them. You need to be like, you're kind of interesting. Something we say at Vigilantes is, I like it. What is it? Like, you don't even have to really understand yet. You just have to have a sense that there is something interesting here. And I think it's one of the big pitfalls is jumping too quickly into the facts, into the rational, and wanting to provide long explanations of that. There's time for that. There's a second date. You can get into that later. Okay. Oh, the real difference between, how do we manage the language barrier as an immigrant in our storytelling? Oh my God, what a great question. You know, I think there are a few things that make it a good story, as we've talked about. There's kind of a structure, and there's the emotion that you feel. And I actually really feel like those are the two biggest things. I think what I would say is, just as everybody whose first language has to practice, I would say it's the same thing. I would say it's about practicing and watching your audience to see where they understand you and where they stumble, and to really pay attention to those places where they're looking a bit confused or they're looking a bit glassy-eyed. People do that with me in some presentations. And try to figure out what is it I can say here that will help them. But I actually feel like language barriers actually don't really get in the way when it's a good story. I think when we want to listen to your story, we're charmed and we're willing to work hard. Same when somebody is really nervous, same when somebody is awkward or someone's up on stage and they forget what they were going to say. I think we as the speaker think that's going to be a deal breaker. I think other people think it's charming. So, and I think they're just glad you're speaking most of the time, or at least that's what I tell myself. So I would say that the barrier is only what everybody else faces, which is in trying to make sure somebody actually understands us. Oh my God, the single most memorable story I've ever heard? That's like when my nieces ask me my favorite color. And then what I usually say is, what's your favorite color? And I'm like, yeah, me too. Yeah. I'm sorry I don't have one. I don't know if it's like if you're into food, which I also am, and it's like there's so many. There's so many categories. So I'm sorry I don't have a favorite. Maybe Dallas? That's super lame. Super lame. Okay. Why do stories sell? Is it because they trigger our reptilian brain? Oh, I forgot branding and marketing. Okay, this is what I'm going to try to explain. I'm going to take a bit of a leap here. It's dark, so I can't tell if you're all glazed over, but I'm going to do my best. So I've been up here today telling you a story, and you can tell that I am speaking. I'm not meaning to dumb this down for you. I'm saying this because I'm going to make another point. You can tell that I'm speaking. And if you are in a company and you're like a founder and you go out in the world and you are telling the story, personally, we get that you are speaking. Something happens, though, when you become a company. There becomes a group of you, more than one often, and you start to have a collective story. And you're not always telling it in person, one-on-one, where you can see the person telling it. So we need a storyteller. We're like, who is speaking to me? What is this company like? What are they about? What's the mission? What's the purpose? What's the values? What's the personality? It's like that thing I said just a minute ago, which is like, I like it. What is it? So, you know when you're at a party and you start speaking to someone and you don't know anything about them yet, you don't even know it's your friend Jess's new boyfriend, you're just talking to some, dude at the chip bar, and he's only said a couple words and you're like, oh, yeah, I like you, you're kind of funny. Okay, let's keep talking. It's not like, oh, you know what, I've got to go and refresh my drink. You don't say that. You're like, okay, I'm going to stick around for a minute and talk to you. Essentially, that's what brand is. So brand establishes a kind of person that represents your company. So when you think about Apple, right away we think fresh, innovative, simple, as compared to like, I don't know, what's a non-startup brand I could think of right now? Nike. Nike is about the everyday hero. It's about gritty. It's about you're running out in the rain and you're a real person and you triumph every time. You're a hero. So brand is about creating a person who is your brand, your company, what the world understands about you so that the world wants to listen to the story as told by that person. That's what brand is. Brand is about creative and the story and how to tell it. Marketing is about the strategy and the actual act of going out and reaching your customers. It's about thinking, what are the channels we need to be on? What's the message we need to be giving? What's the format this needs to be in? And then the practice of actually doing it, of going out and making awareness. And what we would say is brand building is the process of engaging in that marketing, all of that doing, but in a way that builds people's understanding of the person that is the company. Because over time, we see that person over and over again, and it's about how do they go up or down in our esteem. And it helps to have time. I mean, if you think about a company like Tiffany, it doesn't hurt to have a movie called Breakfast at Tiffany's, but it's also because it's old. We've been seeing this person now for so long, we kind of know them. So I don't know if that really explained it, but I would say brand is the person and the storyteller. Marketing is the way we engage in different channels to reach people, and the two are very closely related. Is that good? Okay. As the current chief frog kisser, I love that you really took that on board. I found out that I'm still trying to find the formula to the best story. How many frogs on average do I need to kiss? Oh. Yeah, you and I would be friends here. I honestly think it's hundreds. I really do. I think it's hundreds. I think there's a lot of mirror time. I think there's a lot of time spent telling your story to friends and family, but I think there's a lot of telling your story out in the world, going to networking events, trying out your pitch on people, not in a super cheesy way. Just just in a like, hey, can I tell you what we're working with as a company? And you know what, I'd love your feedback on if you understand this. Okay, so here's what we're doing, and you get into it and you ask for their feedback. But I think doing that is where you do your daily market research. It's where you find out if it's working. But yeah, I'd say hundreds. I'd say hundreds. Oh, how do you transform an inspiring story to a website or social media page, video, landing page, etc.? Okay, let's nerd out, shall we? Okay, so to start with, you get the fundamentals of your story. You find out who you are, what your vision is, what your mission is, what your purpose is, what the things are about what you're doing that are distinct from the competition, your value proposition. And when you see this written down on a piece of paper, it's very underwhelming. It's short, it's technical, it's not that interesting. And then your job is to kind of translate that for all the different formats, all the different channels. So it can be like an in-person way to tell the story, like we've been talking about, like the Pixar formula story, or it can be for a website. And when it's for a website, you learn the ways that channel works. So for example, about a website, one of the things we know is a website works best kind of like an onion. You know, you don't get into the nitty-gritty in the hero module. You start with the highest level, most emotional thing as part of your value proposition, and you put that in the top. And as you go through the website, you get more and more granular. Obviously, I haven't solved this whole problem for you. It takes a little longer than this. But I think what I'm trying to say is you end up with this kind of essence of who you are, that strategy, and then whatever the channel is, and there's website, in-person, social media, video, all these, but each one of them has their requirements, their best practices, their formula, and you translate your strategy into whatever is happening on that channel. Did that help? Could there be a nod? Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Bless your heart. Thank you. Oh, it was really exciting. How are we doing for time?
9 minutes and 45 seconds.
Okay, we can do a couple more. Let's do it. Okay. When telling your story, how do you relate to your audiences, especially? Oh, what a great question. I'm going to nerd out again. So something we do a lot at Vigilantes is audience research. I think it's partly because I started as a journalist and I fundamentally just like interviewing people, but there are a lot of methodologies for it that make it really simple. One of them, actually, let me say something first. I think it's crucial to know your audiences. I think it's crucial to define your audiences. If anyone ever thinks, by the way, which I've heard quite recently, oh, the whole world is our audience. I'm like, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. We have to know who we're speaking to because everybody has their own very particular backgrounds, cultures, jobs they're trying to get done, pain points, things they're looking to have happen, like goals. We have to know what those are because what we're essentially doing is to go back to that strategy we were talking about, what's your value proposition, what are your messages, etc. We're translating that every time we speak to somebody. We're like, okay, here, let me figure out what about what I have here is relevant to you, and the way I do that is from knowledge. So I know some things about what you're trying to solve, and I kind of translate it. You already do this in your everyday life. If there's something you know and you're telling your mom the story, you're going to tell it differently to her from your kid, from your best friend, from somebody you meet at a Thanksgiving dinner for the first time. You're always doing this quick calculation, recalibration of the things you know and what you think is going to be relevant for them. So I think when we're doing it in a more company communications way, it means we just have to become a bit thoughtful. And the way we do that is by interviews so that we really do have a sense of what matters to people. And then we're helping them with the information that actually does solve their problem so that they get what they need about our story, they get their way in, and then from there we can really have a conversation, but we can meet them where they are. That's how we would put that. Oh, okay, yeah, I read this one earlier and I loved it. Is it because they trigger our reptilian brain? You know, the only thing I've been able to make of that is that thing I told you earlier, which is that, I think our world is somewhat chaotic. I don't know if you'd agree with me. And I think the best stories start with something that we all feel, that we're all feeling in some kind of intense way. It's like a question we all have. It's often related to the chaos in one way or another. And then through that period of that story, it becomes solved. There's something that we've been wondering about that gets solved. And innately in that, there's a kind of hopefulness. There's a kind of peace. And we want to join you because it feels like there is a way forward. And I'm not saying this to tell you to deceive people. I really think if you tell an honest story, it does help people figure out if there's a good match, if there is some kind of alignment between the two of you, if there is some kind of value in the two of you having a conversation and continuing on, walking together, working together, helping each other to do the thing you're each trying to do. It creates alignment. How many more minutes? One more?
5 minutes and 50
Oh my God. Thank you for reading that to me because I could never have seen it. Oh my God. Okay. Have you ever experienced an entrepreneur taking a pivot in their plan or business model after going through or experiencing the process of storytelling? Yeah, many times. And I think it's because what happens when you get really clear on your story is you give yourself a kind of a ruler. You take this whole, like, these are all the things that interest us, all the reasons we're doing it, all the things we want to achieve in the world, and you do have to distill it down into something focused. That's what a story is. A story means making decisions. So what we often say about the process of brand building is that brand building isn't a communications tool. It doesn't live in the marketing department. Your story does not live in the marketing department. It's not just about doing social media. It is about doing social media, but fundamentally it is part of your business strategy, because what it can and should do is have you say, I've had this amazing idea, but it doesn't fit with what we're doing. So I have a few choices. I can found another company to do that thing. I can found an offshoot in some way. I can find a bridge between what I'm doing and what that is, or I can make a decision to leave it, or I can change my story. But it forces us to be disciplined and to make decisions because the story has to be coherent. It has to be consistent in order for anyone else to understand it. So I've definitely seen a lot of that. When telling your story, how do you maintain connection with the audience and avoid coming across as simply pitching? Yeah. I think that's that thing about the pulse test for me. It's the thing about really being in it and really knowing you have to feel it the whole time. There's no calling it in. And knowing your job is to connect with that person. And I think if you do that, you can't slip into pitching, because I think pitching by definition is a form of roteness. It's a form of detachment, of running something. And I think if ever we feel that we're not in it, we're not feeling it, there's no pulse. So I think that's how I do it. And I think it's also by paying a lot of attention to whom you're talking to see where are they engaged? Where am I losing them? What are they interested in? And following up on that. You know, there was this host on the CBC who was on CBC radio for years, and he was kind of famous because his producers would write really good question lines for him, and he would follow them religiously. So he might have a politician on the channel, on the show, and the first question would be like, what are your priorities in government this year? And the politician might be answering, and he might be saying, and that's why I am closing down government, and I'm holding the government hostage, starting right now. And then this host would be like, and what are you doing on your summer holidays? It's like, yeah, okay. Did you hear what the person said? So I think that's the other thing that stops us into pitching by rote, is really paying attention to the audience, whether it's an informal setting like a coffee or a conversation, or whether it's a very formal pitch, watching the people at the table or on the Zoom, noticing when their eyes light up and either expanding on that in the moment if you have time or coming back to it later, but knowing it's a live sport. It's live. It's like theater sports, what you're doing. So you can't get into the rote or you're missing all the clues. I'm presenting a project we do in an African lake. Wow. The risk of disaster can kill millions. Oh my gosh. We can and must fix it. Do I make such risk the story or is it the fix? Wow, yeah, no, I've definitely got all the information to answer that question. No problem. It's an amazing question. God. I don't know. I don't know what it is. I think I would say it's about going back to the story and the way you're telling it now and seeing where those pieces best fit. But I would call that a non-answer. Okay, sorry. I hope you win. When your clients come from different age groups, do you need to produce different versions of the same stories, maybe different lingo, or would one version work? Oh, I love this question. Okay, I'm going to go back to the fact that what we need to do when we're storytelling in any way is we need to do audience research to understand where they are, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what their pain points are, their obstacles, their jobs, etc. And we need to speak to where we know that they are. That said, I think one of the most inauthentic things we can do is change our lingo. I think as a brand or as a person, we need to speak as us. I think whenever we change our lingo, we come across as inauthentic. But I would say it is still about telling the story in a way that is us, but is in a way we think they can understand it, both in terms of the key messages and in terms of the accessibility of the language, which to me is different from using lingo. That's it, lingo. That's where we're ending today, on lingo. It's been so lovely to be here with you today. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.